Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give it just a few moments to let individuals trickle in, and then we'll get our presentation started. Great. Well, it looks like we have a significant number of individuals on our webinar today, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining and taking time out of your lunch schedule to engage with us today on what I'm hoping will be a very informative webinar for those of you that are in attendance and those of you that will view the recording later on. Today's webinar is presented by the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. We have two great presenters, and they'll go over U visas for crime victims and survivors, and you'll hear a little bit more from them. Before we get our conversation started, though, I do want to go over just a couple of housekeeping items. One is that this webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the recording will be made available to you all tomorrow afternoon. Contact information will be shared at the end for both panelists, myself, and my other co-presenter from the Cal States, Dr. Anna. And then if we have any questions throughout the presentation today, please use the Q&A chat feature or to ask any relevant questions throughout today's presentation. We will get to all questions at the end of today's conversation. We also have closed captioning available. So if you hover either at the top right or at the bottom right of your screen, you'll be able to see the CC button, and if you'll click that, you'll enable the live captioning for today's webinar. With that, I'm really looking forward to our presentation, and I'll pass it over to Ariel, who will start our presentation today.
Thanks, Alonzo. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. As Alonzo mentioned, we're going to provide an overview to a form of immigration relief that's called the U visa, and it's for people who have been victims of crime. And before we dive in, here's just an outline of what we plan to cover in the next 45 minutes or so. And then we'll make sure to leave about 10 minutes at the end for questions. So we're going to start with an overview of what is a U visa. If we could just go back a slide for a moment. Thanks. Then we're going to go over the requirements to apply, the benefits, what you get when you get a U visa. We'll talk briefly about this somewhat new process called the bona fide determination. That's something that happens while your U visa application is pending. Then we'll just briefly touch on a few other overlapping immigration options for people who are victims besides the U visa. And then lastly, we'll just talk about next steps if you think you might qualify for a U visa. So next slide, please. And then the one after that. So what is a U visa? So the U visa was created more than 20 years ago, which might not seem new, but compared to other types of visas and immigration relief, with the exception of maybe DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which was created just 10 years ago, this is still considered a somewhat newish form of immigration relief. So the intent behind the U visa was to make sure that immigrant victims of crime weren't afraid to report the crime to the police because they lacked immigration status. And so they thought that the possibility of being able to gain immigration status if you report crime would be sort of added as an incentive to, encourage people to come forward and report crime. And, it's a somewhat unusual form of immigration relief because the main qualification is having been the victim of crime and reporting it to the police. So it's kind of like, the silver lining to a bad situation. And, you don't really have control over it, right? But if something bad has happened to you, and you report the crime to the police and are helpful, and we'll talk about, what that really entails, you might be able to get this U visa, and it also has a pathway to a green card and the ability to help family. And then one other thing just sort of about this overview is that there are only 10,000 U visas that are allotted per year. So if more U visas are approved than that 10,000, people have to wait on a wait list. And U visas have well exceeded that number for many, many years now. And so the wait list is also incredibly long. Veto might actually have more updated data, but I believe people who applied in 2016 or 2017 are just now getting U visas. So that's just something else to be aware of. Like, this can be a good option for people, but there's a pretty long wait between the time when you submit your application and when you actually are able to get the U visa. And as we'll talk about later, it can still be a good option for people because it has a very generous waiver or pardon. So compared to other immigration options that someone might not qualify for if they have, some sort of disqualifying criminal or immigration violation on their record, they might actually still be able to apply for a U visa. And then one other good thing about a U visa is there's no fee to apply. So other immigration applications like DACA, for instance, the filing fee can be pretty cost prohibitive. And so here, that's not a barrier. Okay, next slide. So the main requirements, which Veronica is going to talk about in more detail later, but as we've kind of touched upon, you have to have been the victim of a crime, and there's a list of crimes. So it has to be one of these specified qualifying crimes. The person also has to have suffered some harm as a result. The wording is substantial abuse. That can be both physical, emotional trauma, mental distress. It doesn't have to be just a physical injury. And then they have to have been helpful to law enforcement. And that could either be the police, if it's reporting the crime, or potentially if charges are actually filed, it could be being helpful to the prosecutor, which might be like asking you to testify or something else like that. Most of the time, I would say the vast majority, it's just making a police report, but potentially it could also be something beyond that. Okay, and now actually I think I'm going to pass it to Veronica, who's going to talk about these requirements in more detail.
Thanks, Ariel. Yeah, so I will be going over the eligibility requirements for a U visa. These could be thought of as elements that you have to prove to USCIS in order for them to grant you U visa non-immigrant status. And they're kind of the things that the individual who's screening you, right? So the attorney that you go talk to, or the BIA accredited rep that you go talk to, is going to walk through to determine whether you would be eligible to submit a U visa petition. Next slide. So as Ariel mentioned, right, there are these elements, right, that have to be met in order for you to be able to submit a U visa petition. We could think about as 5 things that someone has to prove in order to be eligible for this, right? One, right, as Ariel mentioned, this form of relief was created to help victims in a way so that they would be willing to come forward and report a crime to the police. So the first thing that you have to do is show that you have been a victim of a qualifying crime. It's really important to understand that while there's a lot of things that happen, right, a lot of bad things that happen to individuals, not all the crimes qualify for a U visa. You have to show that you have been the victim of one of the crimes that's actually listed in the U visa statute. And I'm going to go in more detail of what those are in a bit. But I just wanted to, take a pause and mention that because we do get a lot of questions from community members who might have had someone break into their house or steal their car, who come with the police report and ask, will this allow me to apply for a U visa? And unfortunately, those things would not, right? Because they're not part of the statute and they're not listed as one of the qualifying crimes. The other thing you have to show is that you have been helpful to law enforcement, right? So this was created in order for, people to feel more comfortable, right? Coming forward and reporting the crime. So one of the elements and one of the, requirements you have to show is that you were helpful to law enforcement. This means that you have, 1, reported the crime, and 2, you have not refused to help them in reasonable requests, right? And I will go into more detail in a bit about what that actually means, right? But, I think the most important thing to remember is that you have to have reported it to the police, right? Because that's the beginning of the process, making that police report. The other thing you have to show is that the law enforcement agency, whether it's the police department, whether it's the district attorney, right, because the case is being prosecuted, or another agency that has been deemed to be a certifying agency, that agency gave you a certification stating that you were the victim of the crime and that you were helpful to law enforcement, right? And, you know, in it, they'll also show like the harm that you suffered, right? But you need that. You cannot apply for a U visa unless you have that law enforcement certification, right? So without it, you can move forward with the petition. And that is one of the requirements that you need in order to submit your packet. The other thing you have to show is that you've been substantially harmed, right? Or you suffer substantial abuse as a result of the crime, right? This usually means that the crime that you experienced, right? That you were there, that you were, you have a direct result, right? A direct abuse or harm because of that crime that happened. And lastly, you have to show that you are admissible or eligible for a waiver, right? So, you know, immigration has a lot of different things or laws, right, that if you've broken one of them would disqualify you for potentially submitting a petition or for being eligible for a form of relief. So you have to show that you're either haven't broken any of those or that there's a waiver available for you. Next slide. So here's a list of qualifying crimes, right? Like I mentioned, not all crimes qualify you for a U visa. It has to be one of these crimes here. And it's a very, I mean, it's a long list, but it's not that long of a list, right? Of crimes that might qualify you for it. Some of the most common that we see from U visa applications, right, are domestic violence. So having been, you know, a victim of abuse from a partner or a family member, you know, and having reported that, that can make you eligible for a U. Other things we see are sexual assault, right, or rape, sometimes felonious assault, right, could be one of them. It, you know, also if you've been the victim of trafficking or torture, possibly kidnapping, those things could also make you eligible for a U visa. You know, like I mentioned, not everything is included here, right? And these are really specific crimes that can make you potentially eligible for a U. So when you're moving forward with the process, when you've reported this crime to the police report and then the certification would have to check off that one of these, that you were the victim of one of these crimes, right? One of these crimes listed. Next slide. Because immigration law is federal, right? Sometimes the statutes don't match what is stated in like a federal law and what is stated in our own California law. So there are other possibilities to be eligible for a U visa. One of the things that I think is most relevant is this or any similar activity in violation of federal, state, or local criminal law. I wanted to point this out because, like I mentioned, sometimes what the police report might say is not exactly what is on that list, that previous list that we reviewed. But if the crime is similar, right, the activity is similar in violation of some of the federal laws that have been listed, there is a possibility that you would still qualify for a U visa. Something where we see this most commonly would be like felonious assault, right? There's nothing in our state law that says felonious assault per se, but you know, a crime that has been able to qualify under that would be something like robbery, right? Robbery before, if someone was a victim of that, they would be able to, you know, list out the elements of robbery and show how they're similar to felonious assault. And we had seen some approvals in those cases. I do want to note that unfortunately, lately we haven't seen approval for those type of cases, you know, because they've determined that it's not the same in a way, but we had seen it in the past. But so, you know, if you have been the victim of a crime, it's really important to get, you know, to get a police report and go and talk to someone to see if, even if it's not, you know, one of the crimes listed, if it's something similar in the activity in violation of the federal, you know, law that might make you eligible for a U visa. Next slide. So in addition to being the victim of one of those qualifying crimes, you also have to show that you've been helpful, right? There's an element of helpfulness that you have to meet. And this, you know, simply put, is that you haven't refused to or, you know, decline any of the requests made by law enforcement of you. And most often this is, you know, demonstrated by you filed the police report, you gave the police information about the crime, right, and about the perpetrator, and you didn't decline to press any charges, or you never declined a request that came in from them. You know, if the case moves forward and it's actually taken to court, right, and you're asked to testify, then you never refuse to testify if that's an option, right, presented, or you didn't refuse to come in and identify the perpetrator and a lineup of suspects, etc. Right? So you have to, show that you were willing to participate in what was being asked of you, and that you never declined doing that, right? And like I mentioned, most often this is shown by submitting the police report, being willing to give information about what happened to the police, and following with any follow-up given to you by the police. Next slide. The other thing that you must have in order to be able to qualify for a U visa is this law enforcement certification, right? Like I mentioned in the beginning, without this, you cannot move forward to actually submit a petition for a U visa. You need the police department or the other law enforcement agency to sign a form stating that you were a survivor or are a survivor of this qualifying crime and that you had been helpful. In it, they also usually list the type of harm that you suffered because of this, and then it's signed by them. This is commonly known as the B-cert. Without the B-cert, you cannot move forward with the U visa petition, so you need it in order to submit your U visa petition. Usually when you are applying for a U visa, what happens is that you first, get help submitting this law enforcement certification, right? Because you have to wait for it to be signed and given to you before you can move forward, right? So if that first step is denied, then you can't move forward with the rest of the petition. I do want to note that it's really important to remember that this is only given to you for 6 months, right? So they have an expiration date. So from the date you get it back from law enforcement, you have 6 months to submit your complete packet to USCIS so they could review your U visa request, right? So if I get it today, I have 6 months from today in order to submit this. If I don't do it within those 6 months, then I have to go back and request it again. And that often, causes some issues because maybe the law enforcement agency won't want to recertify. So you want to make sure that it gets signed by the police. That it gets signed, right? And that you submit it within those 6 months. Next slide. The other element that you have to show is that you have suffered substantial abuse or harm because of the crime, right? This includes both physical and mental trauma. It doesn't just have to be physical. And, like I previously mentioned, this is showing that you were there for the crime, to put it simply, and that you were harmed because of that crime, right? So in the beginning, I mentioned how sometimes people ask if they're able to qualify for a U if they break into someone's house. That one, it's not listed on the list of qualifying crimes, and also it would be hard to show the harm because maybe you weren't present, so it's harder to make that connection as to what harm you suffered in that instance, right? To explain this, here's just a brief example of how what you might want to show or what can be shown for this or what kind of harm, right? So in this example, Genevieve was the victim of sexual assault. She suffers now from insomnia, has trouble trusting others, which has negatively affected her relationship, and has been diagnosed with depression and anxiety. So in here, right, Genevieve would be able to show first that she's the victim of a qualifying crime, right? It's on the list. We said sexual assault, right? She was the victim of that. And you could show that, in addition to what she suffered because of the sexual assault when it happened, now she shows that she's suffering insomnia, has trouble trusting others, right? So she could submit documentation showing how, she suffered physically and then also now is suffering mentally or has mental trauma because of that. Next slide. The last thing is being admissible, right? You have to show that you have not broken some, the immigration rules set forth in the immigration statute. These, we could think of them as list of disqualifiers, right? So there's certain things that would disqualify you from getting a benefit under immigration law. Some of the common things are like entering the United States without permission, right? So you didn't have a visa to enter or any other type of permit, right, to enter, then that could potentially disqualify you from applying to certain benefits. If you have, broken some of these, or the list of disqualifiers would apply to you, then you would have to show that you're eligible for a waiver, right, that would forgive the disqualifying grounds, right? So to be eligible for a U, right, you have to show that you've never broken any of these disqualifiers, or that there's a waiver for you to be forgiven for having broken one of those disqualifiers or fit within one of those disqualifiers. The U visa has a very generous waiver. This is why often a lot of people who wouldn't qualify for another type of relief do qualify for a U visa, because it pardons almost anything, right, listed in this disqualifier list, from crimes, from having entering without permission, for having been in the United States without status and then leaving and then coming back in. So it waives almost anything, right? But, you know, like Ariel mentioned in the beginning, even though it has a very generous waiver, it also has a very long wait, because so many people are applying for U visas or qualify for U visas. So those are kind of, you know, it's great that you could qualify for this waiver, but then you were waiting for a very long time. Next slide. Okay, and before turning it back to Ariel to walk us through some of the aspects of victims, right, who would be a victim under the U, I just wanted to give a representation of how, you know, the process might go for someone who is applying for a U visa or U non-immigrant status. You know, simply put, right, it goes from having a client intake to getting your law enforcement certification to then submitting the actual petition and then waiting to hear back from USCIS whether you've been approved or you've been rejected. Because of the very long wait, there have been other steps put into place, right, to kind of wait and give options to individuals who are waiting. Before the new process, BFDs that Ariel is going to walk us through, you know, individuals were put on a wait list if they seem to be eligible for the U and were given work authorization and protection from deportation while they waited. And then there was like a review to see whether they would be accepted or denied, right? Now with the BFD, we're kind of looking at the same process of, you know, whether you're going to be, you know, granted, then you might get a work authorization and protection from deportation while you wait for a final adjudication. So the simple, you know, streamlined process has a few other steps now. And I do want to note that, you know, there is a very long wait. So people sometimes think that if they pay certain attorneys extra money, or if they go to a certain individual, they will be able to move the process along faster. That's not the case, right? They have to go based on what's available, which is the 10,000 visas every year for them to move on to either getting a grant or having their application review. And right now they are looking at petitions submitted in 2016, right? And some of those are just being given, you know, deferred action for now while they wait for a visa to be available. So there is quite a wait. So I will leave it there and pass it on to Ariel.
Hey, thanks, Veronica. I also just wanted to note, I was trying to answer questions in the Q&A. We'll also have time at the end. And I think that a lot of these questions we will cover as we go through the presentation. So yeah, hopefully we'll answer them. We'll have some more time to answer them. I guess if we could just go to the next slide for now. I'm going to talk about types of victims and then go through a bunch of examples that hopefully will give you all a better sense of like what sort of qualifies for a U visa. So when we say you have to be the victim of a crime, there are actually 3 different types of victims that the Immigration Service recognizes for the U visa. The first is a direct victim, which is sort of the most obvious. It's if someone was the direct victim themselves. You know, for instance, they were the one who was shot in a drive-by shooting, or they were the person who was abused in a domestic violence situation, right? So I think that one's pretty easy to understand. And then a bystander victim is another way that a person might be able to qualify, even if they were not the target of the crime. And this is actually a much less common way to qualify for a visa. But an example of this would be, and this is an example that the Immigration Service has provided. So it's the main example we have to go off of. But it would be if someone were 13 weeks pregnant and suffered a miscarriage as a result of witnessing a violent crime. So they were not directly harmed in any way, but they were, you know, extremely frightened and traumatized by this thing that happened maybe right in front of them. And they obviously suffered significant harm as a result. And the way that the Immigration Service kind of describes this is someone who suffers an unusually direct and proximate injury. So it can't just be like, you know, you saw something happen and it was kind of scary. You know, there's that additional thing of this person suffered a miscarriage as a result. So that's bystander victim. And then the third type is an indirect victim. And so this is someone who wasn't the direct target. Also, they were not a bystander. It's sort of like they're more like a stand-in for the direct victim. And so it really can only be in a situation where the direct victim maybe died as a result of the crime, or was incapacitated as a result of the crime, or this sort of third thing that's called sort of incompetent, which is sort of like a legal term. Basically, the commonality in all three of those situations where the direct victim died, was incapacitated, or is incompetent is that the direct victim is unable to, work with the police here. They, maybe they're not alive, so they can't describe what happened, or they're in some way, maybe comatose and, cannot verbalize, or if they were a really young child. And so that's the incompetent piece. Maybe they were a really young kid who can't report it to the police, can't provide information. And so a parent might do that on their behalf. And so this last one is a way where an undocumented parent might qualify for a U visa based on their US citizen child being the direct victim of a crime. And there's no bright line rule in terms of like how old the child had to have been in order for the parent to have been sort of the stand-in for them. An example might be like, a 5-year-old child. Obviously, a 5-year-old is not really going to be able to cooperate with the police. And so the parent would do that on their behalf. Something else to note with this indirect victim is that, if a parent is saying that they are, the victim in this, with this definition, they do still have to show harm. And one of the examples will kind of tease out what that would look like. Okay, so I guess next slide. And okay, so this first example is probably the most straightforward. Vanessa and her boyfriend Raul don't have any immigration status. Raul has been abusing Vanessa for months. The police get called to their apartment for a domestic dispute, and they explain to her that she could be eligible for a U visa if she helps them in their criminal investigation of the abuse that Raul perpetrated on her. And, most likely this means just making a police report and not refusing to press charges. Of course, this can get complicated in DV cases because she might be, worried about what might happen to him if she does press charges. But to qualify for the U visa, she can't refuse to press charges. So if, she says she doesn't want him to be arrested, or, that she doesn't want to press charges against him, then they might say that she wasn't helpful. So that's just something to be aware of with a fact pattern. A pretty straightforward example. Daniel was walking home from work and 2 men came up from behind him, demanded money. He handed over his wallet to them, but one of the men also shot him in the leg. He was taken by ambulance to a hospital where he was interviewed by a police officer. And then a week later, he also saw one of the men in his neighborhood, and he called the police again, and that person was arrested. So, pretty clearly he was a direct victim here. This is a crime that would qualify. He pretty clearly probably suffered some harm. He could show his hospital admission records and talk about, also potentially trauma from having this happen to him. So this is another instance where someone might be able to apply for a U visa. So then the next example, just in the interest of time, I think I'm going to skip. It's another example of someone who's a direct victim, right? She was the person who was victimized. Here it is stalking, which is another one of the qualifying crimes from that list that Veronica went over. And I think as you all will have the slides, you could look at this later. So let's go to the next example. So this is an example where a US citizen child might enable a parent to apply. So Laura has a 10-year-old US citizen daughter who was sexually assaulted. Laura reported the crime to the police and helped provide information to them on behalf of her daughter. She also suffered substantial mental abuse as a result of this crime because as a childhood sexual abuse survivor herself, She experienced tremendous guilt and recurring nightmares when she discovered that her daughter had also been victimized. And then also just sort of the anguish of, watching her daughter go through this herself. And so hopefully the facts kind of suggest to you, right, this is something where Laura as the mother would be the indirect victim, but clearly is suffering a lot as a result of this crime as well. And then in terms of what I was talking about with sort of indirect victims, Laura's daughter here was 10. It's possible if her daughter were a little bit older, like 12 or 13, the Immigration Service might, take the position that her daughter could have talked to the police herself about this, and that she didn't need her mother to talk to them. And like I was saying, there's no set age. And so part of applying in a situation like this is really showing that the daughter was unable to, talk with the police. And so she really had to have her mother do that for her, which could, depend on each child, each person, you might be able to make that argument. So then the next example, which is to illustrate a point that Veronica is going to talk about a little bit more later, but it's that family members can also qualify for a U visa. So here we have Selma. Selma's sister was the victim of rape when she was 13. So if Selma's sister applies for a U visa, Selma can also be included as long as she is under age 18 and unmarried, and then the parents can also be included. So based on the crime victimization here of Selma's little sister, all 4 family members might be able to get U visas. So then one more example on the next slide. So Anjali found out that she was the victim of identity theft when her credit card showed over $10,000 in charges that she didn't make. As a result, she had to spend numerous hours setting her record straight. So this is an example of someone who would not be eligible for U visa because identity theft is not one of the qualifying crimes. And, if you can't remember the full list, sort of a good rule of thumb is that most of the qualifying crimes for a U visa are mainly sort of more serious and violent crimes, things like rape, domestic violence, sexual assault, false imprisonment, stalking, kidnapping, etc. So, something like this just doesn't quite rise to the level that it would count for a U visa. Okay, so now Veronica is going to go over some of the benefits when you have a U visa.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'm going to review some of the some of the benefits that an individual gets if they are approved for a U visa or when they're in the process of applying for a U visa. Next slide. So the U visa has a lot of benefits that are available to those who are applying or thinking of applying. The first thing is, like Ari mentioned, it doesn't have a fee. So in order to submit the U petition itself, immigration's not going to charge anything, which is good because then you don't have to worry about paying the amount or trying to qualify for a fee waiver. I do want to note that some of the other applications that go with the U visa, those do have a fee. The most common is the waiver, right? So we said it has a very generous waiver, but that one does have a fee associated with it, right? The waiver itself. But people could qualify for qualify for a fee waiver in order for them not to have to pay the filing fee for that. Also, the U pardons or has a waiver for almost everything, right? So most arrests, convictions, or immigration violations won't necessarily disqualify someone, because even if it's there on your record, you would be able to apply and potentially receive a waiver for those that would allow you to move forward. There was a question that came in the queue about whether a prior deportation might make you ineligible, or a DUI might make you ineligible for applying for a U, right? For those kind of things, you could ask for the waiver, right, and see how the waiver might be able to help you with those kind of things so that you can move forward in your case for the U. Once you submit your U petition and you are granted a U non-immigrant status, you are granted that status for 4 years. So you will be in non-immigrant status for 4 years. And this will give you protection from removal. So you will be able to be in the United States. You have the status to be in the United States. And it also gives you the ability to work lawfully. So it will give you a work permit to go with that. And I think, most importantly with this type of immigration relief, it gives you the ability to then apply for a green card or for lawful permanent status, right? After you have been in non-immigrant status for 3 years, you are able to move forward and apply for a green card. And eventually it will give you the opportunity to apply for naturalization or to become a US citizen. This is important, right? Because not every benefit that someone can receive under immigration would put you on this path towards a green card or naturalization. Most commonly, DACA gives you also protection from deportation and a work permit, but it doesn't give you that status that then will allow you to apply for a green card. The U does. And also it allows you to include qualifying family members, and those qualifying family members would also benefit from these same benefits given to you, the principal, so the main person who has been the victim of a crime. Their family members would be able to also, apply for the waivers, right? So if they have any violations in their record, they could waive for that. They will be able to apply without the fee. And they would also be eligible to get the green card after being in status for 3 years. Most, qualifying family members that could be included are parents, siblings, spouses, and children, depending on the age of the principal applicant. Next slide. So the family members that you could help to get immigration status, right, will depend on your age, right? So if I'm submitting a U petition today, because I am over 21 years old, then I would be able to include my spouse. So if we're legally married, right, I will be able to include them in my petition, and my children who are under 21. Those, two individuals will not have to show that they have also been victimized, right, that they have been a victim of this crime or that they have suffered. They will be able to submit their petition as a qualifying member, and they will be able to also apply for a waiver if there's anything that would disqualify them, and then obtain the status of the protections as they go through the process. If I were under 21 years old, then I would be able to include a few more people. So in addition to my spouse and my children, my children under 21, I would also be able to include my parents, right? We have seen a lot of, petitions for individuals who are 18 and 20, were a victim of a crime. They're able to include their parents who might not be eligible for another form of relief. So then this way they're able to qualify for something. They're able to include their siblings who are under 18 and unmarried, right? So if they have other family members who are under 18 and unmarried, right, their siblings, they are able to also include them in this form to get this form of relief. And this is really good, right? Because a lot of times family members would not have any other option to submit a petition to immigration, would not have any other option to get relief under immigration statute as it is now. So the U visa and being able to include family members, or as we call them in immigration law, derivatives, would be, it's a really good thing, because then they could also benefit from those benefits and then move forward to eventually become residents and then hopefully US citizens. Next slide. So I'm going to pass it over to Ariel to talk about the bona fide determination process.
Great, thanks, Veronica. So I think I'm going to go pretty quickly through this because I really want to make sure that we have time at the end for questions, because there's been a lot of really great questions that have been popping up. Next slide. So this bona fide determination process is just something to be aware of. It's not something like extra you have to apply for. Basically, like you apply for a U visa, and while you're waiting, you might be able to get work permission and what's called deferred action, which is sort of like protection from removal. It doesn't really have any bearing on whether or not you will ultimately be approved for a U visa, because it's sort of a quick review that they do in the beginning just to make sure that you included all of the required components of the application, and they do a background check. And assuming that you pass the background check and you've submitted all of the required initial documentation, then they will give you this work permit through this process called the bona fide determination, or BFD process. And this is something that is relatively new. They only came came up with this thing in this past June, because they recognize that, like Veronica and I have been saying, there's an incredibly long wait, just because they have this 10,000 cutoff. People have talked at different points about trying to raise that limit, but so far we haven't really had any success with that. So we're still stuck with only 10,000. Way more people are eligible for and apply for U visas. And so this is sort of like just an attempt to sort of make it a little bit better while people wait. Next slide. So as we've been saying, it gives you deferred action. Deferred action is sort of a fancy way to say that you're protected from removal. You know, while you have this, they're not going to try and put you in removal proceedings. And then you also get work authorization, you get a work permit, and this lasts for 4 years and it can be renewed. Next slide. And so the process, like I was saying, it doesn't require anything additional on the applicant's side, but just on the immigration side, they do this sort of quick review before they do the more in-depth review where they decide whether or not they're actually going to grant. But they just sort of say, do we have all the required documents and forms? Does this person pass background checks? If so, we can give it to them. And because it is relatively new, we don't really have a ton of guidance in terms of like what passing the background checks actually looks like. They say that as long as the person doesn't pose a risk to national security or public safety, then they can get this BFD work permit and deferred action. But yeah, like I was saying, we don't really know, like if you have, you know, X crime, does that for sure mean that you will or will not pass the background checks? Okay, next slide. And then just in terms of family members, so like Veronica was saying, a really great thing about the U visa is someone in a family has been the victim of a crime. They may be able to include a bunch of other family members who don't have to show anything about having been victimized, about having been helpful. All they really have to show is that they're related to the victim. You know, so parents proving that they are the parents, siblings proving they are a sibling, spouse proving they're married to the victim, you know, whatever. And similarly, these family members can also potentially get this BFD work permit and deferred action, but they will only get it if the principal applicant is granted BFD. And so if the principal applicant does not pass the background checks and Immigration Service decides not to give them the BFD, then none of the family members can get it either. Like I was saying, though, this is a separate process that is not a reflection of whether or not ultimately the U visa will be granted. It just means people will have to wait longer before they can get work permission and this deferred action. And then something else just to note about the deferred action piece is that current enforcement priorities generally mean that ICE is not really going after crime victims. So even if you don't get this specific designation of deferred action as someone who applied for U visa, most likely you don't have to worry about ICE enforcement. Next slide. Okay, and now Veronica's going to run through just some related forms of relief.
Yeah, so just really quickly, I want to go over some of the other forms of relief that someone who might be eligible for a U could potentially also be eligible for, just as a way to compare and contrast, right? What option might be best for you, because the wait for a U visa is so long. Next slide. So these are common forms of relief that are related, right? Because they are for victims of crimes. The first one is VAWA self-petitions under the Violence Against Women Act, right? This is an option available for individuals who have been abused by family members who are US citizens or lawful permanent residents, the U visa for victims of certain crimes like we discussed today, and then T visa for survivors of human trafficking. Next slide. This chart compares the requirements for each of the form of relief. And I just want to note a few, right? So someone who might have been the victim of domestic violence, right, they could potentially be eligible for a U visa as well as VAWA, depending on the facts of the crime. So if I'm an individual, right, and I've been the victim of domestic violence, and I could prove that I've, suffered harm because of this, and that I've been abused by a family member that has status, right? So either a child or a parent, or a spouse that might be a lawful permanent resident or a U.S. citizen, then maybe I could check and see if BAWA would be the better option for me. Under BAWA, I do not need to show that law enforcement is certifying my crime. I do not need to show that I have a police report in order to certify this crime, in order to submit this petition. And it's a lot quicker than waiting for the U visa. But if I've been the victim of domestic violence and the person who committed the crime against me, maybe it's someone I don't know, right? Or someone that I don't have a formal relationship with, right? So they're not my spouse, or parent or child, right? Or they don't have status themselves, then I would go the U visa route, right? Because one of the main requirements for BAWA is that the abuser has status and that they're a family member, a qualifying family member. And the U doesn't have that requirement, but they do require me to have a police report and to have cooperated with the police, right? And there is a very long wait for that. Next slide. The other common crime, right, would be like trafficking. Someone who's been the victim of trafficking could also qualify for a U visa. That's one of the qualifying crimes. For this, I would, have to show the report to the police, law enforcement certified, and I'm cooperating with the police, right, and the requirements under the U. For a T visa, right, it is for trafficking victims of labor or sexual trafficking. And while there is a component of cooperating with the police, you don't necessarily have to get a certified document, right? You don't have to get that certification to move forward with your application or your petition. And there are some exceptions if it happened before you turned 18, right, to that cooperation. And with the T visa, there is a limit for T visas, right? It's 5,000, but that cap has never been met. So if you are able to qualify under a T for trafficking and under a U for trafficking, you might go under, you might try to pursue the T route because that's a lot faster since the cap has never been met. And with the T, you're also able to include family members. Next slide. Some of the things that you might consider as you're looking at your eligibility and if you're eligible for multiple forms of relief, right? And some people look at, how long the wait is. What is the process like? What are the kind of evidence that they require of me? Is there an interview? Is there not an interview? Something really important to people is whether they can include family members or not, right? Does this process allow me to include my children or my spouse? Does it give you the ability to travel home, right? That's a big thing. Will this give me permission to either apply for some sort of permit, or once I have the status, will I be able to travel abroad? Also, will it let me be eligible for public benefits? For the U visa and the T visa, once you submit those and you get receipts, it does open the door for certain public benefits here in California, right? And, does it waive certain grounds of inadmissibility or those disqualifiers? Like we've been mentioning, the U has a really generous waiver. It only applies to the U. And sometimes that's the only option people could go forward with because they have these grounds of inadmissibility. There are waivers for under BAWA and under T, but they might not be as generous as the U one. So maybe that's the only option someone could pursue. Next slide. Okay, so I will pass it to Ariel to close us off.
Okay. Next slide. This can be really quick. The main thing to do if you think you might qualify for a U visa is request the police report. And then, you should probably meet with an immigration attorney to get a full evaluation. But if you mention to them that you think you might qualify for a U visa, the first thing that they're going to ask for is to see the police report. So if you already have that in hand, that's really helpful. They're going to want to look at that report to see what the police actually wrote down. So regardless what description you might give the attorney about what happened and what crime you think was perpetrated, what does it say on the police report is really important, like in terms of the crimes that they investigated. And also, is there a note in there like victim said they didn't want to press charges? Because remember, there's this helpfulness piece that's really important. So requesting the police report is something that an attorney can help you with, but if you already have a copy and you can bring it in with him, that is helpful. And I think actually in terms of meeting with an immigration attorney, if Alonso, you want to talk really quickly about some students who might be eligible for free immigration legal services, and then we can take questions.
Perfect. Yeah. So, all Cal State students as well as all California Community College students are eligible to receive free immigration legal services through one of the respective legal service providers that we have partnered with. They will be able to provide you a full comprehensive screening of if you have questions on U visas or any other forms of relief that you might be eligible for that you're just not aware of. So these links will be available to all of you in the chat box here in just a moment. But please schedule an appointment with one of the 9 legal service providers for the community colleges or one of the 4 for the Cal States. And we can go more into the questions since there are a number of them. And all of this information will be available to everybody in the follow-up email. So great. Can you provide a little bit of clarification on if their family is not in the United States, like if they reside in a different country, are they eligible to receive the benefits even though they don't reside within the states?
Yeah, that's a great question. All right, so I'll take this one running. But so I think something that maybe we didn't quite explain is that the crime has to violate U.S. immigration law. So basically, the crime had to have occurred in the U.S., but family member can be outside the country. The U visa is how it's sort of colloquially referred to, but it's technically U non-immigrant status. But for people who are outside the country and get granted this, they do enter with a U visa. So you can be outside the country and get it. You can even have been the primary victim, victimized here in the US, but for whatever reason be living abroad and get a U visa.
Does that same logic, does it also apply if you were deported and then applying for a U visa?
Yeah.
Perfect. Can you provide just a quick recap if the adults suffered domestic violence, can they include children over the age of 21?
So they could only include, in immigration law, a child is considered anybody under the age of 21. So they would be only able to include their children who are under age of 21 when they submitted the petition.
Thank you, Veronica. And do each family member need to pass the background check?
Okay. Yeah, as part of, I think, pretty much any immigration application you submit, you mail in the application, and then usually you get sent an appointment to get your fingerprints taken. And so all of the applications involve a background check, including the U visa for all family members.
Thank you. Circling through the questions as they're coming in, so give me just a second. Any examples of undocumented farm workers or day laborers qualifying for U visas based on employer abuse, paying them below minimum wage, or not paying them at all?
So there are qualifying crimes related to employment, one of them being PNH or being forced to work without pay could be one of them. So individuals who have been victims of labor violations could definitely, get the information, go talk to someone and see if that type of violation would get them approved for a U visa. I have seen cases where someone was at work, was not getting paid, was being threatened by, with being deported because of their status, who was able to go through the process through the Department of Labor and get certified to apply for a U visa. It's going to depend on a lot of the facts of that case, so it'd be good to go and get screened for those specifics.
And also, I would just add, so this also might be a situation, Veronica talked about sort of related forms of relief, where maybe they could also get a T visa. And if you qualify for both a U visa and a T visa, which is like trafficking, it can be like labor trafficking. A T visa is the better option if you qualify for both, because there's also a cap of the T visa, but we've never reached it. And so, whereas like the U visa, there's a ridiculously long wait, there's not with a T visa. So this would be something, to sit down with an attorney and talk about.
Thank you. If the U visa is denied, are they in any jeopardy of being deported?
So this is something I was sort of talking about a little bit earlier. Probably not. Under Biden and sort of the current enforcement priorities in terms of like the people that ICE are supposed to focus on, it's people with really serious crimes or who have engaged in terrorism or recently crossed the border. If they don't fall into one of those categories, then they're generally not the people that ICE is supposed to be focusing on. And then separately, they're also supposed to be taking sort of a victim-centered approach, which is, taking into consideration if someone's been the victim of a crime or has a pending U visa application, or even if they were denied, they still were the victim of a crime. And so that's really not someone that ICE is supposed to be focusing on.
Thank you. And I know we have so many more questions to get to, and I apologize that we did not get to every single question, but just looking at the time, I think we have one more before we wrap up. Around sexual harassment was the crime and it was filed, but there's no trial. They didn't testify in court. Do they still qualify for a U visa?
Potentially, yes. So in order for you to qualify for the U visa, there is that element of helpfulness with the police, the law enforcement, right? And it's enough to have reported the crime and not denied, any request for help. It doesn't need to be prosecuted, right? So it doesn't have to go to court. That person just need to be found guilty in order for you to be able to qualify for the U. In that case, it would be good to get the police report or whatever report you have, and then go talk to an attorney or a BA accredited rep that could review it, just to make sure that the elements are there, and then request the B cert. But there's no need for it to be to reach prosecution for you to be able to apply.
Thank you. And I apologize that we aren't able to get all of the questions to today. Some of them are very case specific, and so I'll just remind everyone to please connect with an immigration legal service provider to get your free comprehensive screening. Ask any of the questions that and subsequent conversations with a reputable attorney to help you navigate what forms of relief are available to you. And we'll be providing the links to where you can schedule those both for the Cal States, the community colleges, and if you are a resident of the state of California, there'll be a full comprehensive list of available legal service providers that might be able to support at free or low cost. So I thank our two presenters today, Veronica and Ariel, for their time and their expertise in sharing with us what are the requirements for U visas and walking us through just a general sense of the U visa. I found it very helpful, and I hope that everybody that attended today found it equally helpful. Again, I'll be sharing the recording, the PowerPoint, and all of the links that we shared with you today, and some additional links that we'll share with all of you today. So if you have any follow-up questions, I'll also add my email along with the point of contact, Dr. Ana Aguayo-Bryant from the Cal States, and Ariel and Veronica's information. So thank you all, and I appreciate your time, and we will talk to you all soon.
Thank you.